Speaking of big houses, Ralph Grossi told me at lunch something I don't think you heard, that in Marin County, California, they have just passed an ordinance that if you are on ag land and you build a house larger than 3,500 square feet, you lose ag classification. I think that's quite unique. And it started on his farm with his own covenants and guidelines for his family, and then they've adopted it countywide. That's quite something that would be effective in a lot of the valleys where you all live and where we live. Speaking of big houses, it was about a year ago that Laurie and I were invited to a little get-together for the board of the Rocky Mountain Institute, Amory Lovins, and they were having a meeting. We just went to the little cocktail party afterwards. It was at one of the board members' large houses. It was a huge house. The house was about as high as this whole stage, and this front side here was mostly glass, exposing the great room. And the challenge for the board was, what would they do to green this monster? And they were coming up with all kinds of little things that technologically would make this house all right. We looked at each other and thought, this is absurd. This house should be torn right to the ground and start all over again. So we've heard a lot of people believe that we can get out of our problems with technology and that we can maintain our consumptive way of life, our wasteful way of life, and just be inventive. I think Lovin's guru used to believe that if there are too many people on the earth, we'll just rocket them to other planets. And so I think there comes a time when we've got to look a little deeper. A couple years ago, I read Jim Kunstler's book, The Long Emergency, and it took me for a loop, and I bought copies and gave it to many other people. It's the kind of thinking we need. It's not just wishful thinking, it's not wild-eyed optimism, it's realism, I think, and very, very important. I think we're lucky to have him here. I'm delighted to introduce Jim Kunstler and bring him to the stage.
Well, thank you. Something interesting happened about in the mid-90s that set me along this path of inquiring into the energy picture. I had already been thinking and writing about it in some previous books that I wrote about the suburban predicament. What happened was a bunch of chief geologists for the major oil companies began retiring out of the system. And once they had secured their pensions, they began to speak out and to publish monographs and to publicize their views. And the main thing that they were trying to get across was the idea that the oil age actually had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that we were approaching somewhere past, we were approaching the middle, the peak, the top, the all-time production peak for oil. And of course, we began to understand from their writings that they referred to their mentor, who was M. King Hubbert, the former chief geologist for Shell in the 50s and 60s, and Stanford faculty member, and Colorado School of Mines professor, who had formulated a model for understanding the profiles of individual oil fields, which also applied to oil regions and indeed to oil nations, and finally to the world as a whole. And the conclusion from all that was that oil is a finite resource. We started this industry of extracting it. We're going to reach a peak of extraction, and then we're going to go down over the arc of depletion. And we also began to understand some of the important points about this. Perhaps the most important one being, it's not about running out of oil. something that the public and the media are deeply confused about. Not about running out of oil. It's about the complex systems that we depend on for daily life faltering and wobbling and ultimately failing because of a depleting oil supply, a depleting supply of the most important energy resource that we have. And by complex systems, I mean the way we produce our food, agriculture, dependent as it is on oil and its byproducts, the way we do commerce and trade, the way we organize school, the way we organize, the way we occupy the terrain, all of these complex systems. And that's the important takeaway point. We've learned quite a bit more since the mid-90s about where we're at. One of them is that it's now self-evident that the United States is in extremely vulnerable condition. We now are near the end of our initial oil endowment, and this diagram shows pretty much where we're at. We peaked in 1970 in the United States, and we were producing 10 million barrels a day then. Now we're producing just under 5 million barrels a day. And we use about 20. So we're importing 2/3 to 3/4 of the oil that we use. And of course, much of it comes from places that are not friendly, places populated by people who don't like us, that are unreliable trading partners for this resource. Now, one of the things we've also learned as the picture resolves over the last 10 years is that many of the, indeed, all the other oil producing nations are also past their production peaks and in decline. The only one that there's any question about at all is Saudi Arabia, and the information over the last several years seems to indicate that they are past peak and that the cuts in production that we've seen from them are not voluntary. They were producing, just in the last year, they have gone down more than 1 million barrels a year in production. They were producing 10 million barrels a day and change in 2006, and now they're producing month on month about 8.4 million barrels a day. And we suspect that the great oil field of Saudi Arabia, the greatest one ever found, the Ghawar field, is now in depletion. Russia peaked in 1986. They have a lot of oil, but they have also extracted so much, and they went through a peculiar change when the former Soviet Union fell apart. And they are now in steep decline. The North Sea, which along with Prudhoe Bay in Alaska basically saved the West's ass in the 1980s and 90s, is now in steep depletion. And, as this PowerPoint thing, I hate to use these PowerPoint messages, but this one needs to be understood. When you apply the latest and greatest technology to oil fields, you only succeed in depleting them more efficiently. That's exactly what happened to the North Sea. And now the United Kingdom is a net importer of oil for the first time in 20 years after their great fossil fuel fiesta of the last 20. And the poster child for the problems that we're facing is Mexico. The Cantoral oil field, the second largest field ever found, second only to Ghawar in Saudi Arabia, is in steep decline, a minimum of 15% decline. The Mexican oil consumption is increasing, and the really important part of this is that Mexico is our number 3 source of imports. And their oil industry is in such steep decline because 2/3 of it is made up of the Cantoral oil field, that they are not going to be sending us any oil in a few years at all. And of course, we also enjoy the advantage from Mexico of not having to put the oil in tankers. They can send it by pipeline, and that was a great advantage. Well, we're going to lose that advantage, as well as losing our number 3 source of imports. Plus, we're going to have an extremely disorderly nation to the south of us, because this is going to destabilize whatever stability remains in Mexico now. The last time Mexico went through a political convulsion in the early 20th century, they had a very long revolution that went from about 1930 to about 1940. A quarter of the Mexican population left, and the population then was about 20 million. Now it's over 100 million. So imagine the kind of disorder that that is going to produce and the effects on the U.S. And that's just a little bit of background about, let me just go back and say one more important thing. The salient thing in the picture that is now emerging is this, that what we're facing next is an oil export crisis. Not just a depletion problem, but an export crisis, because it's beginning to become apparent that the oil exporting nations, while they're in depletion, their exporting rates are going down even more steeply than their depletion rates. So if the depletion rate is 3% in Saudi Arabia or the North Sea or Iran or Russia, if the depletion rate is 3%, the export rate is declining by 7 to 12%. And that's largely because in most of these other nations, they're using much more petroleum themselves. The Russians have imported something like 50% more cars just in 2006 than the previous year. They're using much more of their own oil. So the export crisis is going to be the next thing, and that, of course, is something that the United States is deeply vulnerable to because we have to import so much of the oil that we use. So that's a little bit of background, and I'm not going to go into the whole peak oil theory thing. I'm more concerned about the effect on our thinking. Climate change, Al Gore has covered that pretty comprehensively, no need to go into that. And I'm not dismissing it. All I'm saying is, you guys already know about that, and I need not belabor that. So I've bundled this set of problems into a title I called The Long Emergency. I think it's going to define the decades ahead, and I think it's going to be a period of disorder and turmoil and economic hardship. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that we're making in the assumptions that we hold, and this assumption goes pretty broad through our culture, is that we're entitled to an orderly transition from where we are now to where we're going. And we're not entitled to anything. And it's probably not going to be orderly. And we probably got to revise a lot of what our assumptions are about what's in store for us. I lectured for many years on urban design because I was deeply disturbed by the phenomenon of suburbia, the fiasco of suburbia. And I don't think that you can overstate the problems that it presents. I now define it as the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of the world. And I call it that because it represents the spending of vast resources on a living arrangement, an infrastructure for daily life that has no future. And the American public doesn't get this. It has no future because an oil-based, happy motoring fossil fuel fiesta is not going to be with us much longer. And a living arrangement based on it will not work. The fact that it has no future engenders or entails several other problems. And they're mainly collective psychological problems that we have as a culture, because we're doing a very poor job of understanding what we're in for. And I think you can describe the main problem as the psychology of previous investment. The psychology of previous investment. And what that means is we've put so much of our resources of the late 20th century into these infrastructures for daily life, the suburban pods, the subdivisions, the big box stores, the malls, the highways, the fried food shacks, all the crap that goes with it, all of the accessories and furnishings of it. We put so much of our resources into it that we can't imagine letting go of it. We can't imagine it, and so we can't imagine the behavior and the response that is necessary to deal with a living arrangement that has no future. To make things worse, over the last 15 years, as we basically drop-kicked our manufacturing economy out of the country, we replaced it with an economy that was based on, guess what? Building more of a living arrangement with no future. That's what the housing bubble was about. Building more suburban sprawl, building more stuff that is not going to work for us. So, not only are we saddled with that, but now we, as that starts to unravel, we're going to have additional problems with not having an economy. Something like 40% of the jobs created since 1999 have been in housing. And if you subtract all that, the home builders, the realtors, the people who sell the granite countertops, et cetera, you subtract that activity from our economy, there's not much left besides fried chicken, hairstyling, and open heart surgery. So we got a problem with that. And by the way, this doesn't help. No one's having a better day down here because of that. In fact, it only tends to underscore our cluelessness. And so this is going to be coming to an end. I keep on telling this to audiences, and they literally don't believe me. The progressives don't even believe me. The home building industry is going to die, and it is not coming back. It is not. We're going to say farewell to it. It is not coming back. The production home builders, the realtors are all sitting around waiting for business as usual to resume and to become normal again. It's not. What you're seeing is the end of the cycle. It's really over. So one of the problems I have is, people come to me all the time wringing their hands about, the suburban sprawl around my neighborhood or my town, it's getting worse and worse and worse. And I'm telling you, it's over. What you're seeing are now just the last twitches of a dying form of behavior. We also fail to understand that agriculture is going to have to come much closer to the center of American economic life again, or we're not going to have a civilization. This affects especially the environmental community, because the environmental community has been stuck in their understanding of what rural typologies really are. Stuck in this idea that the rural landscape is only for recreation and scenery. And we're going to have to change our view about that. We're going to have to get really on board with the idea of having a productive rural landscape locally, where we can grow our own food, where we have a different way of valuing what rural land is, not just for scenery, not just for recreation, and certainly not for any more suburban development. And that's going to require the rebuilding of a firm and coherent consensus about what these landscapes mean. No combination of alternative fuels or systems for running them are going to allow us to run the stuff we're running in the American economy on any basis, or even a fraction of it. There's not going to be a hydrogen economy. There's not even going to be an ethanol economy for motoring. No combination of, we're not going to run Walt Disney World, Walmart, and the interstate highway system on any combination of oil products, ethanol, biodiesel, used French fried potato oil, batteries from coal produced electricity, or any of those things. And we're going to have to get our heads screwed on about this. I want to be really clear about this, though. I'm not saying we should not use alternative energy systems. However, we're going to probably be disappointed with what they can actually do for us. And we're still going to have to make other arrangements for living differently, and very severely. One of the things I would suggest to you is this, is that we're probably not going to put up very many giant wind farms. There's a great wish that we would do this. My own guess is, forget it. We're probably not going to do it. If we use electricity generated by wind at all, I think as this situation evolves, and it's going to be a disorderly situation, I think what we'll see is that it's going to be used on the household basis, if you're lucky, or the neighborhood basis, or town or district basis, but not on the giant, 400 units of the 400-foot-high Godzilla-like turbines. That isn't going to happen. Nor are we going to run the interstate highway on biodiesel. This was an unfortunate remark. But the thing is, the important point is that it really represents the way the American public feels, including the progressive elements of the American public. Because the environmental movement, to some degree, also feels that the life as we know it is not negotiable. And we're going to have to overcome that idea. One of the consequences of all this is there are some severe impediments to our ability to form a coherent view of what's happening. And the main one is wishful thinking. You know, the idea that when you wish upon a star, your dreams come true. And because we are a special, exceptional, entitled people, if we wish hard enough, our dreams will come true. And by the way, that message comes to us, we're bombarded with it daily, and have been all of our lives from the from television, broadcast advertising, and the other sources of, you know, from the Hollywood movies, the Spielberg movies, the Disney movies, all are sending us the message that we're all special, and that if you wish hard enough, your dreams will come true. And it is very important to understand this, that we have to stop wishing for stuff and actually doing stuff. Because one of the main characteristics of being an adult is knowing the difference between wishing and doing. It's very important, but we don't understand that anymore, very broadly across our society. And it is a very dangerous misunderstanding, because we're going to be just stuck there, left there, wishing for stuff when we should have been out there doing stuff. And I'll try to give you some examples of that as we go along. The other impediment to thinking that's very pronounced is represented by the greatest new religion in America, which is not evangelical Christianity, by the way. Are there any evangelicals in the audience? Any born-agains? Not too many. You should see what happens when I do this at a Southern university. All the hands go up. Oh, thank you, Jesus. Well, the leading new religion in America is the worship of unearned riches. Okay? These are the true believers at their devotions. And this is an extremely dangerous idea, because it's based on the more fundamental notion that it's possible to get something for nothing. And if you combine these bad ideas, the idea that it's possible to get something for nothing, with the idea that when you wish upon a star, your dreams come true, you have a whole nation full of people who essentially have become infantilized and are expressing infantile ideas and unable to deal with the circumstances that reality is sending to them. One of the interesting delusions that we see is the idea that technology and energy are the same. They're identical, they're interchangeable, they're substitutable. And if you run out of one, you just plug in the other, right? And we're going to find out very painfully that that's not true. You know, we're either going to run these things on liquid hydrocarbon aviation fuel, or we're not going to have an aviation industry. We're not going to have that kind of transportation system. And by the way, we're not going to change out the hardware, okay? All over the world, we've got like a $3 trillion investment. In every airline in the world has an investment in Boeing 737s, 47s, 57s, Airbuses, Embraers. You know, they're not going to get rid of that stuff and get new airplanes. So either these are going to run on liquid hydrocarbon fuels, or they're not going to run at all. The most dangerous thought that is now current in our society, in the dialogue that's going on about this all over the nation, is the idea that if we can just come up with a rescue remedy to run all the cars, that'll be great. And that's what I'm seeing out there, and it's especially pernicious and pervasive in the environmental movement. You know, I meet every day I meet people who want me to give them brownie points for driving a Prius. You know? The problem isn't that we're driving too many big cars. The problem is we're driving too much of any kind of car. That happy motoring has taken over our lives, that we're driving incessantly, that driving is mandatory. So it's very important to get on board with the idea that we have to concentrate on other things. And I'm going to very explicitly tell you and lay it out what the other things are that we have to pay attention to besides running the cars. You know, and my big beef with Amory Lovins was the idea that he spent the last 13 years developing a hypercar along the assumption that that would be a great environmental gift, benefit to American life. That if we only had cleaner, sleeker, more energy-efficient cars, that would solve the problem. Guess what? The main unintended consequence of that idea is that we could continue being a car-dependent society. So what could be a greater exercise in futility than to continue to support car dependency in any of its forms? So the environmental movement has to get its head out of its ass about that. And in fact, I'd go as far to say, that if we could harness the power that we're producing from blowing green smoke up our asses, we'll solve this whole problem. And it's probably not going to happen. So we're going to have to get real about making other arrangements instead. And we don't want to talk about that. The environmental movement, the progressive political movement, doesn't want to talk about anything but running the cars on French fried potato oil and getting brownie points and getting medals for driving sleeker cars. And I don't want to hear anybody say that to me, for the rest of the day, that they drive a Prius and aren't they great. So we're going to have to, people twang on me all the time and say, oh, you don't have any solutions, dude. Well, the cognitive dissonance that is now flowing through our brains is so thick that it's like, it's like leaking potato soup. You can't see through it. And the fact is, I am trying to actively promote the idea that there is an intelligent response to the long emergency, an intelligent set of behaviors and tasks and things that we can do that will make this a less disorderly and less of a hardship than it would be if we keep on doing the other stupid things that we're doing, okay? And so now I want to propose these things to you. We're going to have to, starting from the upper left, we're going to have to inhabit the terrain differently. We're going to have to grow more of our food close to home, probably involving more human attention and fewer machines and fewer fossil fuel inputs, possibly more animals. We don't know. But the main thing is closer to home, because the age of the 3,000-mile Caesar salad is now coming to an end. We're going to have to, on your lower right, we're going to have to do trade and commerce differently, because the Walmart model of commerce is not going to survive the long emergency. We're going to have to do schooling differently. And we're going to have to make things again in our own country. And we have no idea how we're going to do that. I'm going to talk about all these things comprehensively, okay? We're going to have to inhabit the terrain differently. And I think the new urbanists really have been in the forefront of understanding this predicament and furnishing us with a set of really good tools for being able to do this correctly. And that is, the great achievement of the new urbanism are not the little new town developments that they did in various parts of the country. The great achievement of that group is that they dove into the dumpster of history and they retrieved a set of principles and a body of culture that our culture threw away, because we thought that we could just build a human environment using nothing more than traffic engineering and statistical analysis. And we now see what the result of that is all over the country in these miserable places that we've built. We're going to have to live in traditional towns, villages. These are going to have to be coupled with a truly productive agricultural landscape. And also with commercial relationships between these things that are real and not fictional or pretend. And we're going to have to probably return to a lot of the methodologies of urban design that we have not been following for the last 60 years or so. Okay, we're going to have to grow our food differently. The Archer Daniel Midland, Cargill, and Monsanto model of putting all the oil and gas inputs on the soil and then having the cheese doodles grow up, that model of agriculture is not going to be with us very much longer. So we're going to have to do that very differently. And there are a lot of implications to that. I'm going to go into that a little more deeply later. This is a diagram that shows you how much retail space we have in America compared to other countries. Okay, we don't need more big box stores, okay? And their whole model of existence based on incredibly robust replication of more and more stores, that model's going to fail because we don't need any more of this stuff. And a lot of the other elements are going to be in terrible trouble. We are probably going to have less friendly trade relations with China in the years ahead as we begin to contest with them over the remaining oil in the world, in the limited places that it exists. And as that occurs, our trade relations are going to suffer. And they're going to be sending us fewer salad shooters. And American incomes are going to be going down. They're already that process is well advanced. There are going to be far fewer customers for the plastic salad shooters. And the whole issue of the 12,000-mile supply line from Walmart to Asia is probably going to get into trouble, along with the warehouse on wheels, which is based on the incessant circulation of 18-wheel tractor-trailer trucks. So their whole system for doing business is going to fail. It's probably going to fail very quickly. You know, somebody mentioned to me yesterday, oh, but they're so big. Won't they do something to prevent that from happening? And, you know, my answer to that is forget about it. You know, there's not much they can do about it. They're just kind of stuck. And they're just going to fail, and all of the things that are modeled on that, like, you know, the Target stores and everything else like that, is going to get into trouble too. I think what we really have to be worried about is what happens with the supermarket model for distributing the food, because that's liable to fail too. And as that occurs, that's really going to become a crucial thing. You know, so how are we going to do commerce? Well, first of all, we are going to be compelled by circumstances to rebuild local networks of economic interdependency, whether we like it or not. You know, one of the big intellectual arguments that have been made very broadly in favor of suburbia is the idea that it's okay because Americans like it. You know, anybody with more than an 8th grade education can probably recognize that as an extremely fatuous idea. You know, that just because you like something means that the world will allow you to do it, you know. But that's what we get from David Brooks of the New York Times and, Joel Kotkin and Bob Brugman of the University of Illinois, who wrote a book called Sprawl in favor of it because people liked it. You know, this is now intellectually normal thinking for in our culture. And you know, what we're going to discover is that it doesn't matter whether you liked it or whether you had a good time with it for 25 years or what, you know, the circumstances that reality is sending you is going to determine what you do and how you behave. And we're simply going to have to rebuild local networks of economic interdependency, whether we like it or not. We'll probably be much happier when we do this. We're a long way from doing this. We have no idea how we're going to manufacture anything. We're not going to relive the 20th century. You know, in my part of the world, which is the Upper Hudson and Mohawk Valley, an old manufacturing area, most of the factories are now being disassembled and bulldozed. Or they're awaiting that fate. And we're not going to go in there and reuse them because most of them were actually designed to run in one way or another on cheap fossil fuels. And we're not going to relive the age of the giant factory, but we have no idea at what scale we're going to be making things. And probably the only thing you can really predict is we will almost certainly have fewer things to buy, that the whole consumer fiesta, the blue light special experience that we've been enjoying for the last 30 years is going to fade into the background of life. It will no longer be in the foreground of life. And consumption, as we call it, is no longer going to represent 2/3 of the American economy. And so we have no idea how this is going to come out, but we're going to have to start thinking about this. How are we going to make things? And some of you who are young people who maybe like to make things or like to do things with your hands or are inventive in that way should start thinking about this. You're going to have to make some of the things that your society needs. How are you going to do it? Schooling, a big problem for us because among the other tragic decisions that we made in connection with suburbia was the idea that we'd build all these centralized school districts and save on administrative costs and compensate for that by busing all the kids around from a 100-mile radius pupil shed, right? Well, the yellow school bus fleets are going to fail. We're not going to be able to afford to run them, and the centralized school districts are going to fail with them, and all the little flat roof schools that we built all over America that are the same kind of building in Florida as they are in Minnesota, and which are hard to heat in Minnesota, and hard to air condition in Florida. Those buildings are going to fail as buildings, and then we're going to be stuck, and what are we going to do? But this is, by the way, the Hannibal Lecter Central School. Las Vegas, Nevada. Notice it has no egress. The inmates can't get out. The thinking behind this just amazes me, the idea that you design a school like a maximum security prison, because it sends the message to the kids that school is punishment. Not that it doesn't send the message that school is a magnificent, privileged activity of receiving the transmission of 5,000 years of culture. It sends the message that you must have done something bad to be sent to this miserable place. And thank you very much, Sierra Club of Las Vegas. That doesn't make it better. This is only the lamest example of about 1,000 I could show you of greening up, putting the parsley around the pig. Doing a miserable job of designing the buildings and having miserably low standards in our communities for accepting these things, because we basically tacitly approve of them. They don't get built without our approval. This is okay with us all over America to build schools this miserable. So we're lucky that circumstances are going to take them away from us, because they're killing us and they're killing our kids. We shouldn't send children to buildings like this. Okay, now this is very important. Very important. We have to restore the passenger railroad system. We should have started 40 years ago, but we were too brain dead, and we didn't do it. It is the most important project we could undertake that would have the greatest impact on our petroleum use, okay? We have a railroad system that the Bulgarians would be ashamed of. It's that bad. This is a very, very important project. It would put hundreds of thousands of people to work at meaningful jobs at all levels, from labor to management. It would benefit people in all ranks of society. It doesn't involve reinventing anything. We already know how to do it. The infrastructure for fixing it is lying out there rusting in the rain, waiting to be fixed. And we're not even talking about it. And here's the important thing. The progressive element of our society is not even talking about it, okay? I mean, maybe you can understand why the non-progressive, the retrograde elements of our political system aren't talking about it, but it's inexcusable and disgraceful that progressives are not talking about this. This has got to be injected into the presidential campaign. It's disgraceful that the Democratic Party is not talking about this. And the fact that we're not talking about it shows how unserious we are. All we want to talk about is how we're going to run our cars on corn. And that is not worthy of us. It's so dumb. A Pennsylvania farmer put it to me very succinctly. He was the president of the Pennsylvania Sustainable Agriculture Association, which was a very impressive organization. I went to them, it was the biggest audience I talked to in years, 1,500 people. Most of them young, all of them healthy. Very impressive, very intelligent people. And gave me a lot of reason to hope. Anyway, the head of their society said, we see where the ethanol thing is going. It's quite clear to us. We're going to take the last 6 inches of Midwestern topsoil and burn it in our gas tanks. So we got to get started on this, okay? We can't afford to not talk about this anymore. And if you consider yourself a progressive or a Democrat or in opposition to whatever, the established order in America now, you've got to bring this to the attention of your political leaders, okay? It's that important. We know just from the statistics that moving stuff by rail and by boat are much cheaper, much more efficient than moving things in trucks. And we're going to have to do this. It's one of those things that circumstances will require from us. There's a social dimension to this that's probably pretty scary for people. When people tell me that my book frightened them, I know that they probably are referring to this. This is not going to be an orderly process, and I emphasize again, those of you who are trying to put across the idea that we're just going to administrate ourselves out of this, or organize our way out of this, or technologicalize ourselves out of this, you're going to be disappointing the public when you say those things. This is going to be a tumultuous time, because we're going to have a very large new class of people out there, the formerly middle class, and they're going to be very ticked off about the loss of their entitlements to a certain way of life, to the non-negotiable way of life, which, Dick Cheney defined very well. The American public believes it's non-negotiable. They're going to be really pissed off when they find out that reality is negotiating it for them. Because that's what happens. If you decline to negotiate the circumstances that the world is sending your way, you get a new negotiating partner automatically. And its name is reality. And then it negotiates for you. So the thing that I'm worried about is that we're going to enter this process, and we're going to be a people, a society of individuals who believe it's possible to get something for nothing, who believe that when you wish upon a star, your dreams come true, who believe that, who have been complacent and passive and feckless for 40 years, and they're going to beg somebody to push them around. They're going to beg somebody to direct their behavior in some kind of a purposeful way to save their asses. So I don't worry about George Bush. I worry about what's coming after George Bush, and what's coming after what comes after George Bush. And I hope that this doesn't happen, and we have to be very careful about it. A lot of this social turmoil is probably going to arise out of the agricultural picture, because as the jobs disappear and the incomes disappear and the houses are repossessed and the middle class becomes a formerly middle class, there are going to be a lot of people with no incomes and with nothing to do and with nowhere to live. And a lot of them sooner or later are going to have to end up in the agricultural sector doing things that they never imagined they'd be doing when they were at Monroe Community College taking a cosmetology course. And we have no idea how we're going to reallocate the land for this. And we have no idea what the attitude of the pissed off people is going to be to the people who retain wealth in productive land. And this is a recipe, by the way, through all of human history, for revolution, and for seizure of property, and for the circulation of elites, for one group of elites to be knocked off their pedestals, and for another group of elites to seize their property. And these are the kinds of things that we have to be aware of, because we're not that special. We're not that exceptional. Being an American is a great thing, but we're still human beings in the flow of human history, and shit happens. And the same shit is going to happen to us as happened to other people. And we have to be prepared for that. So agriculture is liable to be one of the really sore points about this as we struggle to reorganize this society. The city, the whole question of the city. We're going to have to inhabit the terrain differently. But one of the things that's going to happen, and I think this is sort of counterintuitive for a lot of people, is our cities are probably going to contract. Our great cities, and by this I mean everything from Baltimore to Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Atlanta, Orlando, Houston, all of these things, all these places, have attained a scale that is simply cannot continue at that scale. And they're probably going to contract. The contraction may be very disorderly, possibly ugly, possibly violent, but it'll occur. And I think that what you're going to see is that as the cities contract, the ones that are best positioned, that occupy the best sites on harbors and things, are going to re-densify at their cores and along their waterfronts. This kind of thing is already happening, by the way, in Baltimore. The process is well advanced there. You can see the future if you go to Baltimore. And a lot of the cities that in the West are going to be in a special kind of deep trouble because they don't necessarily occupy important sites. And they suffer from other locational problems. Phoenix is going to dry up and blow away. It's not going to be there anymore. First, what's going to happen is there'll be tremendous problems over mobility from non-cheap and scarce gasoline. Then there's going to be a sort of an ethnic battle over whether the Anglos or the Hispanics will occupy that territory. And then they'll discover very painfully that that part of North America cannot support any sizable population of any ethnic group. And that's going to be the cycle. The good news is that in Las Vegas, the excitement will be over. So the cities are going to be different. And it will be important to recognize the cities that are favorably disposed to continue in some way or other and those that aren't. Some of these issues will revolve around global warming. Are the harbors too low? Boston, for example, is actually a city that has quite a bit of topography to it. So a lot of it is going to still be sticking out of the water, even if the sea levels go up 10 feet. That's not so true in Philadelphia. It's not so true in Baltimore or Charleston. So, Southern California is a whole other story. And I think somewhat similar to the story in Phoenix. It's going to be a much smaller place and probably very disorderly. And so the city of the future is probably going to be a thing of greatly reduced scale. As far as I can see, I think that we'll be lucky if we end up with something on the order and scale of the Gothic city, of the kind that are still visible at the centers of the great European cities today. We'll probably rediscover the meaning of the public realm as the automobile becomes a diminished presence in our life incrementally. And we'll regain a sense of place, and more importantly, regain an understanding of what it takes to design and assemble meaningful places that are worth living in and worth caring about. Because what we've managed to do over the last 50 years is to create in North America 30,000 places that aren't worth caring about. And when we have enough of them, we would end up with a land that would be not worth defending. And that's pretty much, I think spiritually where we're at, because this stuff is not worth defending. And the destiny of it is going to be a sad destiny. The destiny of suburbia generally is going to be sad and tragic. Probably be a combination of ruins, salvage, or slums. So when I give this talk in universities, I frequently get a disappointed reaction from the kids, who say to me, "Can't you give me some hope? Can't you give us hope? Can't you give us hope?" And of course I can't give you hope, because I'm not a hope dispenser. But this again shows the interesting mentality of where our intellectual class is at now at this point in history. I'm 58 years old, so my whole adult life has been with the fruits of the age of Aquarius. And I've seen how it's infected the intellectual life of our nation. One of the more interesting things I saw along the way, back in the 90s, I went to a conference on the future of the American city at Yale, and it was just at the high tide of the ascent of political correctness. And so all the academics came to this symposium, and one after another, they got up and said the same thing. They all said, "We must give self-esteem to the poor people in the cities." They're angling for the same kind of brownie points that the Prius owners are now trying to go for, showing that they're morally concerned about the self-esteem of the poor people. So it was my turn to get up, and I said, "Let's give cocaine to the people in the cities." Because it makes you feel great about yourself without accomplishing anything. And we have a whole generation of people who think you can just give self-esteem to other people and hope to people, like they're some kind of a hope dispenser. And maybe it makes them feel magical. because certainly it comes out of magical thinking. But the truth, and what I will tell you and what I tell the college kids in the audiences around the country, is that you have to generate the hope yourself. You have to become a generator of hope yourself by proving to yourself that you're a capable person, that you can accomplish something meaningful in light of the circumstances that reality is sending you, that you can be brave enough to face the truth about your reality, and that you're a competent adult. And you do that incrementally, slowly, by accomplishing things that demonstrate to yourself that you're a potent, powerful individual, that you can make things happen, that you understand the difference between wishing for stuff and doing stuff. So you guys have to generate that hope yourself. And don't go around asking your elders for it. You know, I think another one of the consequences of this is that we're going to end up with a younger generation of young adults who are going to be able to do that, because they're going to be full of youthful energy and the aspirations of youth, and they are going to go out and contend with these realities successfully. And they're also going to punish the shit out of the older generation. They're going to take away our pensions. They're going to not care about the operations that we need when we're 80 years old. You know, you need a lung replacement, go die. That's how it's going to be. Because they're going to be really ticked off at what we did to their world. And at the incredible irresponsibility of this generation sitting around wishing for some super fuel so you can continue running your cars. And they're going to get it. So on that note, I'm going to ask you for questions, and then we'll do a little of that, and we'll go on with the conference. Thank you. Thanks. Now look it, I realize this has been a bit of an ordeal for you, and you know this has been sort of a harsh message. You know, I apologize somewhat for the harshness, or I probably wouldn't do it differently again. But you know, I just want to say one thing. You know, it was interesting to hear the governor yesterday, because he's a guy who's somewhat younger than I am. You know, he is a bit younger than I am, and he has come up in his own way. It's a very interesting character. You know, lived in Saudi Arabia, has actually quite deep experience outside of Montana in the world. He's very enthusiastic. I think that what you're going to see eventually is that, you know, you're going to have to modify his vision. It's not going to just be about putting up wind farms and, you know, sequestering the CO2 from all the coal so you can keep on living 70 miles out away from your job in Bozeman. You know, you're going to have to do the same thing here that we're going to have to do in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and everywhere else in New York State. You're going to have to live closer together. You're going to have to inhabit the landscape differently, and you're going to have to make other arrangements for all these other things. And the last thing that you should ever expect is, you know, as we enter this period in the next 5 years, when things become difficult with oil, you're not going to get another 500,000, you know, Hollywood producers moving up here. You know, that isn't going to happen. So forget about that. And I also urge you to really review, relentlessly, remorselessly review the assumptions that you've got built into these models of yours about, you know, what you're expecting. Because I think the ones I've heard are highly unrealistic. You know, they're extrapolations of the business as usual that's been going on recently, and it's just not going to continue. Anyway, with that, let's take it from you over there on the left.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you for this talk. It's been very interesting and inspirational, and yeah, I think you're delivering a message that does not get delivered there enough, which is basically, well, we have to change the way we live.
Right.
My question is as follows. How would you conciliate, I got the impression that you were talking about a system in which you would have towns that would incorporate highly productive agriculture, which wouldn't use any sort of fossil fuels. And I don't know if this assumption is incorrect, but I would assume that such cities or towns would have low population densities. How could you conciliate those low population densities with effective use of scarce energy resources, which would also be present in your... So basically, for example, if you're talking about a railroad system, if you have 300 million US citizens spread around in small cities with their own farms, how could you make that railroad system viable in the sense that it could get everybody to where they need to go?
Well, first of all, I think you misunderstand some of what I'm thinking and saying. I'm not saying that we're going to necessarily live in, in the kind of low-density places that you seem to have in mind. In fact, quite the opposite. I think we're going to see an agricultural landscape that will be populated much more than the current one is, because it'll require more human attention, more human activity in it. But I think that our towns of whatever scale, whether they're hamlets, villages, towns, or cities, are going to be much more dense, and that a lot of the residual fabric that is now around them is going to kind of fall away and disintegrate, especially the suburban rings sort of incrementally. So this would be a longer discussion between you and me, but I don't think that you quite heard what I was saying right. I also don't think that we're going to not have any energy sources whatsoever. I think that we are resilient, resourceful creatures, and I think we're going to have some fossil fuels left. We're probably going to have some kind of biofuels of some kind, although, I think realistically we may only be running some agricultural machines on them. I really don't know. We'll probably be doing, some solar, some wind, some hydro. We're not going to be without power, but we're going to be living on the planet differently than we are now. So whatever your notion of what normality is today, it's going to be quite different. And by the way, one final thing. Look, we had a perfectly good railroad system in the United States before 1945. It was the envy of the world. It was so good. And then we let it all fall apart. And now we're the only advanced nation in the world that doesn't have a railroad system that's any good. So we already know how to do it. Obviously, it will not serve some kinds of population centers now. The dispersed suburbs of Orange County, California. They are not going to be well served by rail of any kind. Probably, won't work. But I also I think that the populations are going to disperse from those places. So I'm not sure that there's necessarily any happy outcome for them that we can really foresee. And it's another example of the idea that it's going to be a disorderly process. We don't have all the answers right now. I can't give you, 100% coherent answer about how we're going to link all these things together any more than I can tell you how we're going to make our household products after 50 years of stopping that and not doing it anymore. Okay? So let's move on to the next person.
Ted Pacek, UC Berkeley. Thank you for the excellent talk. I'm a little bit wary of talking to this microphone. I will have two comments and a question. The first little comment is that Marion King Hubbard ended his career at the University of California at Berkeley as the university professor, which is the highest rank of professor ever bestowed on
I'm sorry,
anyone.
I got that wrong.
That's okay. That's us. The second one is that you alluded to something incredibly important. The technical issues are secondary, the psychological issues are primary, and I would encourage everyone to read the book Consumed by Professor Barber, which then leads me to my third comment and half question, that when you deal with 300 million or 250 million of infantilized lunatics, who sit on 30 or 40,000 nuclear warheads, you got yourself a problem. Which then leads me to my last question, which is now a more serious question. The last time this picture was kind of valid throughout the world, humanity had less than 1 billion people. Today, we're approaching 7 billion people. And in all these talks, and I give a lot of them as well, we always omit the most important sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room. What are we going to do with 9 billion people?
Well, let me answer that question, because somebody asked me that earlier today. And I'll tell you what I said in my book, the long emergency book, that we're not going to do a damn thing about it. There's not going to be any policy. There's not going to be any protocol. There are not going to be any steps to mitigate them unless they're really severe ones of the kind that we wouldn't want to think about. nature is going to take care of that problem for us by attrition. And the usual suspects are going to step into the picture and do what they do. And I don't talk about this because I don't think that there's any program that we're going to undertake that realistically is going to deal with this. Let me just say one more thing about this. I was talking to somebody earlier about the same thing. I think we saw the model for this in what happened in Russia when it stopped being the Soviet Union. Over the period of the next 15 years, they lost about 30 million in population by attrition. And what it represented, and there were no big headlines around the world, you know, on CNN, Russia loses millions in population. And nobody paid any attention to it. It just happened, you know, and it happened because those people who were living on the margins, you know, the very elderly people, the sick people, the people who had become alcoholics or drug addicts, you know, those people fell through the cracks and they died. And the population went down. And it continues to go down. And I think you'll see a similar thing all over the world, that without any headlines and without any hoopla, we're going to see a lot more attrition. And there could be. I mean, we could also have epidemics. You know, things like that could happen. But I think these projections that I hear about, oh, well, in fact, Mr. Grassi said the same thing this afternoon, or this morning, that, you know, we can expect to have 9 billion people on the planet, you know, and that a great proportion of them are going to be demanding the same standard of living. You know, I'm sorry, I don't believe that at all. Long before that happens, the standard of living of everybody in the developed world is going to start sinking down, and we're not going to have new members of the club. And so there's going to be a lot of attrition. The reason I don't talk about it is because I think it's pointless. It's self-evident what's going to happen.
Well, it's not self-evident to most people. Also, I would like to point out that it's not only oil that is peaking. There's many other resources which are either close or getting to the peak. And I'm talking, for example, about nickel, which is used by the Prius lovers in their batteries, and copper and many other elements of the periodic table, which are kind of getting exhausted. And so the changes that will have to occur in the next 10 to 15 years, and I have a very firm date, 15 years, it's going to be a very different world. We'll start to have dealing with them right now. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Simon. I'm a student researcher with the Colorado College State of the Rockies
I didn't understand a word you're saying.
Is that a little better?
Just speak slower.
Okay. My name is Simon. I'm a student researcher with the Colorado College State of the Rockies project. And as you were speaking, I was thinking a little bit about the urban poor, and I was wondering if you had a similar forecast for them as you did with the middle class. I'm from the Boston area, and it seems to me that now the urban poor, although incredibly marginalized, reside in precisely the location where everyone is going to need to live very soon. Do you think that they're just going to get pushed out, or what?
Yeah, I think that will be part of the kind of disorder that we're going to see as the life of the city changes, and it's hard to predict how disorderly it's going to become. You know, this is also a subject that is so delicate and sore for many Americans, including most white Americans, that we can barely bring ourselves to think about it. You know, one of the things that I wrote in The Long Emergency, and, you know, and I think that we're going to see that it's true, is that a lot of the culture of the underclass of the last 20 years is essentially warrior culture. And we're going to have to contend with the consequences of that. You know, we've been pretending that it's entertainment.
Your discussion is so sobering, and I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to hear you today. I'm a high school science teacher, and I show my kids the end of Suburbia, which features you and all of the points that you've made. And I guess I'm out there feeling like I'm Chicken Little. And I tell my students, you come back and see me in 20 years, and I'll be so happy if you've proved me wrong. But I wonder, since now I see that my job is at stake because the model of school is not going to work anymore, I better find a new career. But what is the role of education in motivating those young people so that they can help us get out of this mess, or is it just going to have to be the shit hits the fan and then we respond?
Well, it's very hard to be in the position of a science teacher explaining what we're facing when you get no support from any kind of consensus in the adult community about what's out there. And that consensus doesn't exist. We have failed to create a cultural agreement about what these set of problems really mean. So naturally, you're going to feel isolated, and I'm sorry you do, and I'm glad that you're brave enough to contend with it. There's only one thing about education that I might add to this discussion here today, which is that I don't see education failing completely and not existing. I see it being reorganized in a way that's probably counterintuitive to most of our thoughts. We are not going to rebuild and redistribute a whole mirror system of new schools distributed more equitably closer to the places where people live and have them be smaller and more human scaled. That probably isn't going to happen. We're going to be a less affluent nation in 10 years than we are now. We're not going to have the resources to be able to do that. But I think what you'll see is that education will continue. It will probably grow out of the homeschooling movement. It will probably not be based on just evangelical homeschooling, which is now one of the principal motivators of homeschooling is the Christian movement. There's going to be a secular homeschooling movement, and the homeschools are going to aggregate into larger units, and that will be the basis of whatever kind of schooling that we have that follows the collapse of the centralized school districts.
Thank you.
That's my opinion anyway.
Jim, it might be worth talking about the Cuban example, what happened in the mid-90s with Cuba as kind of a preview both of the trouble and possible solutions.
Yeah, well, we have heard something about this, and actually there's something I do want to say about it that people haven't mentioned. Cuba, of course, went through a convulsion in the early 90s when it lost its fossil fuel subsidy from the Soviet Union as the Soviet Union collapsed. And all of a sudden they were forced to make other arrangements very quickly. They reorganized agriculture in a couple of years. They redistributed land. They developed, they bred oxen like crazy so that they could use working animals in the fields. And they did a heroic job of reorganizing agriculture. Also, in the process, the average Cuban calorie intake went from something over 2,000 calories a day to well under 2,000 calories a day in the process. So it was not a process that happened without sacrifice and hardship. But one thing that people don't, people hold that up as the poster child for how people can overcome a situation, but they leave out part of the picture, an important part of the picture, which was that as that occurred, most of the rest of the world was still up and running, doing okay in the background of Cuba. Cuba's going through its convulsion, but North America's still okay, much of South America's still operating normally, and there are a lot of remittances that are flowing into Cuba from the United States, subsidizing the economy. And that's the important point. The next time when the advanced nations find themselves going through a similar convulsion, it's not going to be against the background of an orderly world. It's going to be against the background of a world that is increasingly disorderly, dysfunctional, perhaps violent, and is not going to be so easy.
For the benefit of people in the room who might be looking for something to start with, and for the young people in the room, a long time ago there was a young man known as Governor Moonbeam, Jerry Brown, who got the governorship of California. One of the first things he did was put together a 7-group effort called the Small Farm Viability Project. The Small Farm Viability Project showed in great detail what the change, at least in the agricultural portion of this undertaking that has been described to us today, would look like. And so if you're really interested in finding out what did a bunch of smart people 30 years ago think about solving the issue of great agribusiness, et cetera, you might look at that.
Well, a lot of things were undertaken 30 years ago. I happened to be one of the subjects of Jerry Brown when he was governor because I lived in California for a year. And I had some beef with the franchise tax board, as a matter of fact, over my miserable $14,000 a year salary. Anyway, We did a lot of interesting things in the 70s. You know, that was the one sort of really shining moment for the hippie generation, for my generation, when we went, you know, I was a young newspaper reporter when the OPEC oil embargo happened, and it made a huge impression on me. Especially impressed me how dysfunctional the normal American living arrangement could be if it was stressed just moderately. And out of that movement, you know, a lot of people got busy doing a lot of things. And I reported on this stuff because I was a journalist during that period. I covered the small hydro movement in the Northeast and the solar house stuff, you know, a lot of this stuff. A lot of the new urbanists were people who came out of that, and guys who, you know, were 27 years old when the OPEC embargo happened, and they got really involved in green building, and then they came to a very important realization that it wasn't just about the buildings. Our towns sucked, you know. The buildings weren't just a problem, so we deployed them on the landscape, you know, in these meaningless aggregations of, you know, with single-use zoning. And so that's the point where they said, oh, we got to jump into the dumpster of history and figure out how they built Siena, Italy in 1500. You know, and they became heroes that way. So there were a lot of good stuff was done then. What should impress us now is how brain dead our whole culture is, and not just the stupid people, not just the Republican golfers, not just the NASCAR morons. We expect those people to be stupid and dysfunctional. What troubles me and what should trouble us is how dysfunctional and stupid the environmental movement is, with its preoccupations with scenery and recreation. And running the cars heroically on soybean oil. You know, that's what should trouble us. Why are we still thinking that way?
I'm curious if you have any idea of a timeline, because I'm really looking forward to the castles above Aspen falling.
Well, my timeline would be we're going to be in real trouble, severe trouble in the next 5 years, and that 2007 is a pivotal year. It's going to be a pivotal year for the oil export crisis that's developing. We're really going to see that having an impact on the whole world in many strange ways before Christmas of this year. And, you know, the combination of that and the fiasco in the finance world, the fiasco that's associated with it in the mortgage lending and banking industry, and the related securities and hedge fund rackets are going to send great tremors through this society, and going to start having a big impact. So I got a message I got to stop, and thank you very much. And let's carry on with the program.